Right, hello. So, good evening. It's Thomas Daffern speaking for my weekly fasting broadcast against Brexit, against the madness of the current world, and for peace, truth, honour, and decency. And against lies and ignorance. I mean, I'm a teacher, so these are like my weekly, almost like a sermon, I suppose you could say. When I lived at the Castle of the Muses in Scotland, I did a sermon every Sunday. Because we had a beautiful chapel with a great windows, stained glass window of St Paul at the end, and that was at Loch Goyle. And, a variety of local people and people from further away would come. I recorded them. I've got them in the audio files. They weren't filmed. So in a sense, it's my kind of Sunday sermon, and I hope everyone is well. Events in the world are very interesting, should we say. I want to share a few things I've been up to this week and make some comments about wider world affairs. Obviously today, yesterday, it's been the Equinox, the spring equinox here in the Northern Hemisphere, which is, it's a beautiful time. I went to some of my local mystical sites around here in Druid heartland of Gaul, in La Creuse it's called. All the provinces of France are named after rivers. La Creuse is named after the river La Creuse. And that has two branches, the small and the big, La Petite et La Grande. And I live close to La Petite Creuse. So I went down there to commune with nature yesterday evening in the sunset. Exquisite. Rivers are just beautiful. And I'll come back to rivers in a minute. Equinox stands for balance, poise, and for justice. It's also the time when in ancient Athens, this was the time devoted to Athena. The Athenian city, a very cultured place, a city I still know and love well. I've been to the Acropolis, I've done my worship in Athens, so to speak, of reason and Athena. And they had a 5-day festival just for the goddess of wisdom. Can you imagine if we could bring that back in every country? I imagine that's what the French revolutionaries thought they were doing by having a little festival of reason in Notre Dame. Of course, it didn't work. They weren't able to explain it, I think, to enough people, and did it in a way that, it was sort of anti-Christian the way it came out, which is totally wrong. Christianity and reason are supposed to be bedfellows, consorts. Christ, taught from the place of cosmic reason, the Logos. And so you can't have the cosmic reason as opposed to reason. There's a lot of fine-tuning of theology needed for that conversation to be perfected. So we're also coming up to Easter. It's obviously Lent, and it's a time for reflection. So I think justice is very much connected with balance and poise, and I'll come back to that point shortly. So happy equinox to everyone. I hope you have justice in your life, balance, mental poise, get the old cosmic reason cranked up, get it working. It's your right to enlightenment. The fundamental point of my broadcast is to encourage people to study, to reflect, to muse. I'm recording these in the Museum of the Muses here in the middle of France, and musing is a birthright. Thinking is an activity, as Fichte said, a German philosopher. And as an intellectual coordinator of the World Intellectual Forum in Europe, we have a duty to activate our cosmic reason, our divine intellect, not just our ability to calculate and do sums and calculate in a narrow self-interest kind of way. There's a wonderful quote from Plato, the people that think like that, who simply calculate out of self-interest, should not be called lovers of wisdom, but rather lovers of cunning. And unfortunately, most politicians, even quite a few academics, are just practitioners of cunning. Well, I'm not. I'm a philosopher, which means I'm in love with real wisdom and truth and the depth of thinking. And I think that's what we need to get out of this chaos. As you know, last week I talked about Orpheus and the Orpheus Eurydice story, and how, in a sense, we have to all be that Orpheus going into the darkness, the underworld, to rescue the soul of the lost truth. Our beloved, who is Britannia in the case of Brexit, who is Scotland in the case of the Scottish independence campaign, who is Europe, who is, stands for wholeness and love and so on. We have to somehow bring her back out into the light. She's our own lost soul. She's the Mary Magdalene, if you want, of the mysteries. So how are we going to do that? Okay, well, my strategy, one of my many strategies, I have several, is scholarship and study. I've been involved again with the World Wisdom Keepers Forum that my friend Sachin Raja coordinates. We've been discussing, what we can do from our different perspectives. My contribution to this project of rescuing the lost soul is through scholarship, and therefore what I've been doing, writing this book on religious mathematics, is intensive research. And this last week I've been working on the Platonic tradition and the Pythagorean tradition, both of which are vastly important, hugely complex and really interesting. And they emerge out of the Orphic mysteries that I spoke about last week. The Orphic mysteries were very ancient, 900 BC, and based on much, much earlier traditions from Thrace. The Druids had an impact, the Bronze Age culture. An archaeologist has found a great city in Bulgaria where, it's a ruined place. It's the largest megalithic site in the entire Balkans, and they're building a big visitor centre with European Union money. The Bulgarians say, bless them, thank you for that. And, there are many mysteries in Bulgaria and Thrace still not discovered, and it's an archaeologist who's made this discovery. So anyway, building on the Orphic mysteries, we come to Pythagoras. Now, I've taught about Pythagoras ever since I started my teaching career back in the 80s. At the University of London, I was lecturing in comparative religion and philosophy. And I always enjoyed doing my talk on Pythagoras. And I've written about these mysteries. He's an extraordinary character. Half Phoenician, half Greek, from Samos. World traveller, like Orpheus. In a sense, he was replicating the career of Orpheus. And he was working within the Orphic mystery tradition. We know that he spent many years in Egypt, and he also went to Phoenicia and took initiation in the temples there. And there was a life of him written by a much later but a very great philosopher called Iamblichus, who was from Syria and was a Syrian, working in the Neoplatonic tradition. And Iamblichus was a very clever man who researched and did his scholarship in the libraries, and he described the life of Pythagoras and his ideas. He studied for some time with Thales, who was one of the great early philosophers in the pre-Socratics, as they're called, that I had to study when I did my philosophy degree at Bristol. And he says of him the following: enjoying such advantages, therefore, he sailed to Sidon, as in Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon, both because it was his native country and because it was on his way to Egypt. In Phoenicia, he conversed with the prophets who were descendants of Moschus, the physiologist. Some interpreters think that means Moses. Interesting to be called Moschus, the physiologist. And with many others, as well as with the local hierophants. And Iamblichus is writing this in about 290, 300 AD. so long after these events. He was also initiated into all the mysteries of Byblos and Tyre, and in the sacred function performed in many parts of Syria. Now that's quite amazing, because Byblos was a port, still is, on the coast of Phoenicia, or Lebanon as it's now called. And it's where the origin of the word the Bible comes from. Our Bible is simply a book from Byblos. And it was an ancient Phoenician city, a trading city, with many, many mysteries and temples, and to die for traditions. I mean, the Phoenicians invented the alphabet. Before the Hebrews, before the Greeks, before anyone, they had the alphabet. And they were trading with North Africa, with Egypt, with Greece, with inland. They were going as far as, the Mesopotamian region. And, to be initiated into all the mysteries of Byblos and Tyre, I mean, gosh, that is quite an achievement. He was led to all this, not from any hankering after superstition, as might easily be supposed, but rather from a desire and love for contemplation, and from an anxiety to miss nothing of the mysteries of the divinities, which deserved to be learned. So that's important. I mean, a lot of people get caught up in a sort of New Age acquisitiveness. You have to have this course, that degree, that charter, this esoteric, label. Chogyam Trungpa, the great Tibetan Buddhist sage, called this spiritual materialism, and he diagnosed it as a problem with the West. It's great that Western people like spirituality and want to learn about it, but it's bonkers that they've sort of turned it into a capitalism. And you have, all these sort of New Age type things coming up with, sell buy sort of schemes. Well, the Amicus is making the point, no, that's not Pythagoras. He wasn't doing it for that reason. He was doing it because he genuinely wanted wisdom in the depths. Okay, and then he goes on. I won't read the whole thing, it would take ages, but he goes on by boat to Egypt, which is like the promised land for most Greek sages. Plato, as we'll see, spent ages in Egypt. Orpheus did. All the intellectuals of any value and worth in Greek, depth went down to Egypt for their finishing school. Here in Egypt, he frequented all the temples with the greatest diligence and most serious, studious research, during which time he won the esteem and admiration of all the priests and prophets with whom he associated. Having most solicitously familiarized himself with every detail, he did not, nevertheless, neglect any contemporary celebrity, whether a sage renowned for wisdom, or a peculiarly performed mystery. He did not fail to visit any place where he thought he might discover something worthwhile. That is how he visited all of the Egyptian priests, acquiring all the wisdom each possessed. He thus passed 22 years in the sanctuaries of temples, studying astronomy and geometry, and being initiated in no casual or superficial manner in all the mysteries of the gods. At length, however, he was taken captive by the soldiers of Cambyses and carried off to Babylon. Now, I should just explain, this is a very interesting historical note. Cambyses was the Shah of Persia, or Iran, and he conquered Egypt at this time. We know that historically, and what's really interesting is that here's old Pythagoras getting caught up in all that. But I don't think he was in prison, because the following sentence reads as follows. In Babylon, he was overjoyed to be associated with the Magi, who instructed him in their venerable knowledge, and in the most perfect worship of the gods. Through their assistance, likewise, he studied and completed arithmetic, music, and all the other sciences. After 12 years, about the 56th year of his age, he returned to Samos. So that's the invokes, just summarising. I just wanted to share that because it's awesome, really, that this man should have done this, and he was in the right place historically at the right time. I mean, he's the fountainhead of Western higher education, because what he then does is he goes to Samos. He meets the ruler. Unfortunately, was a bit of a tyrant, as they're called, like a bully, a sort of Boris Johnson, shut up and do what I say kind of person. And Pythagoras, in disgust, realised he couldn't teach his wisdom there. He went to Delos, he travelled about, and eventually he moved to southern Italy, to Crotona, which is a beautiful city on the kind of instep of the boot of Italy, as it's called. I've travelled past it by train. That coast is exquisite still to this day. It's full of mysteries. And so he founded his mystery school there and then taught. He got married, he had some daughters, he devoted his life to then teaching about the mysteries he'd learned, which included mathematics and religion. So in my book on religious mathematics, obviously he's a key figure. He coined the phrase philosophy, and in the various writings about Pythagoras it explains that. So to me he's a symbol of this lost wisdom that we need to rediscover, which unfortunately in our modern world we've split off the sciences from spirituality. We've split off technical knowledge from ethics. So we have people that manufacture weapons of mass destruction, and they're only just being held in check by a few people with ethics operating in the military and political systems. I mean, we're hanging by a hair's breadth as a planet. Our technical knowledge has got to the point where we can invent trident missiles that can target 50 separate cities at once. One missile going up can destroy 50 cities the size of Moscow. That's in the name of the Queen and the British, elite, and the Russians can do the same, the Americans do the same, etc. Well, if you throw ethics out the window, what's to stop that happening? So that's why we're in such a perilous position. Okay, so I've also been writing about Plato this week. So after Pythagoras, the next in the succession of transmission of wisdom was Plato. Now Plato was like an after echo of both Orpheus and Pythagoras. His life story almost recapitulates theirs. He, born in Athens, from a well-to-do aristocratic family, reputedly descended from the last king, Codrus. Plato was, as a young man, he was very good at athletics. He was a strong chap. He wanted to be a playwright because that was the cool thing to be. This was the great heyday of the Greek stage. The great Sophocles and Aeschylus and so on had been doing their dramas. He wanted to write comedy. But then he met Socrates, and he became fascinated by Socrates' mind, his teachings, and he used to hang out with Socrates and the other listeners and auditors and people that found dialectic, as Socrates called it, so interesting, which was the give and take of ideas. So they discussed everything under the sun: justice, truth, knowledge, education. Is it possible to teach someone to be virtuous? Well, one of the problems with that is if they aren't virtuous and they don't even have a clue what the concept means, how can they possibly learn virtue, and how will they know when they've become virtuous? They talked about love, they talked about eros. Is it okay to love people, just platonically, as we call it, and when is it appropriate to love them physically? What about homosexuality? Is that ever acceptable? And by the way, the answer to those questions is yes, you can love people of a virtuous soul. It doesn't matter really their gender. Love your true friends who share virtue with you. Anyway, amazing stuff. And I strongly recommend people to read the collected works of Plato. If you haven't done so, it is one of the great treasures of world civilization, not just European. And it's an intellectual feast to read all the dialogues. There's about 30 dialogues. I read all these when I was in Canada as a young student in my early 20s. And it's really like coming home. It's like a sort of wake up of, oh my God, that's what this is all about, you know. Underlying the Platonic dialogues, which are very witty, they are like comic plays. Each one is a little play. And I'd love to see them performed. I'd love to get a theatre group together to perform them around the world. You know, we should take it round after COVID. Because, you know, they've got little ironies, and he uses humour very, very delightfully. It's a kind of intellectual humour that you have to understand stuff to even begin to understand the jokes. Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff. But underlying it is a serious thing that Socrates, for all this wit, for all this humour, is about to be judiciously murdered. He wrote these dialogues after Socrates had been killed by the Athenian authorities, who'd fallen into the wrong hands, right? And this is a lesson for everyone that opposes Boris Johnson and his Brexit nightmare government that has hijacked the UK and is pretending that the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish don't matter. They've done a tyrant takeover, you know, a tyranny. But it's a soft glove type approach. So it's friendly, smiling face. Meanwhile, all your rights are being burned. Well, no, what Plato said was that's totally out of order. And when Socrates was killed in this judicial farce of a trial, sort of set-up job, the absolute perversion of this is he was accused of impiety. This man, Socrates, was one of the most pious people ever to walk the earth, in that he wanted truth. He wanted to know the real truth behind our actions, our ethics, our politics, our belief systems, our religions. And yet the officialdom accused him of impiety. You know, it's that inversion of truth into lies that underlies the problems we face as a planet. Back in Socrates' time and still now. Nothing has changed, really. Sadly, we haven't seemed to progress very far. What Plato did was, along with Socrates' other close friends and disciples, they left town because they didn't want to be rounded up and killed off. And they all went to Megara and then scattered. And Plato spent nearly 20 years travelling. He went to Egypt again, like everyone did. He went to southern Italy, and he was always interested in meeting people that had heard or met people who knew Pythagoras. He was trying to find the mysteries himself. And he did. He encountered extraordinary people. It's like Gurdjieff's meeting with remarkable men. I always think the life stories of Pythagoras, Orpheus and Plato should be made into 3 blockbuster movies. They're full of action, adventure, extraordinary stuff, love interest, everything's in there. And travel and adventure, and you can shoot them on location, and amazing. If anyone wants to fund the movies, get in touch. I'll write the script. And amazing, they've never been done, right? And we could also do the complete theatre performance of Plato's dialogues as part of the deal, right? That'd be the little. Each one of those would be a movie, effectively. So there's 30 movies, right? Yeah, that'd be fun. Okay, so afterwards, he eventually decided that, having spent his life accumulating all this wisdom, he ought to go back to Athens and teach and share it, because he loved his city. It's like me, I'd happily go back to England. I'll teach at Oxford or Cambridge or London or wherever. Give me a chair, and I'm happy to come back and teach, because I love my country. It's just fallen into crazy hands and ignorance. Happy to go and teach. In fact, I applied for a Regius Chair of Philosophy at a British university not that long ago. I'll keep applying, But Plato went home, and he went to Athens, and he was given some land by a colleague just outside the city walls called the Grove of Academus, which was a sacred place. And in this time of the sacred festival of Athena, the people contested with poetry and dance and song and drama. They put on performances, and the winners were given a crown of olive leaves woven into a thing like the thing I have, and it came from the groves of Academus. So it was always considered this is the holy place of wisdom. Academus was a heroic figure from Greek mythology, and this grove was kept as a sacred site. So it was ideal for Plato to build his Academus, his academy, and that's where the word academic comes from, or academician. And the first thing he did was build a temple to the Muses, because as a devotee in the Orphic and Pythagorean mystery traditions, Plato knew that knowledge is not just about facts, compiling facts, kind of stuff you churn out in school exams. You learn it, one night before the exam, you churn it out, you forget it the next week. That's not education. Education for Plato is the transformation of the soul from darkness into light. It's the ending of our false and vain desires. It's the ending of our ignorance morally. Which is why the biblical texts like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and all the great Solomonic writings and the prophetic writings of the Hebrews chimed in with what Plato was teaching, and later the Christian Platonic tradition, or the Jewish Platonic tradition, or indeed the Islamic Platonic tradition. All of their greatest philosophers, realised that Plato was a sort of universal teacher whose ideas were of value for all time and all place, not just for his immediate little circle in Athens, although that was humming with amazing people. And he lived on to his 80s. I mean, incredibly, the system didn't kill him off. He kept teaching. He sort of founded what is effectively the first, academy in the world, but the first university, effectively. They did research into politics, into economics, into mythology, into language, and into many different forms of knowledge. And of course, one of the greatest students of Plato was Aristotle, who then took the ideas forward even further. And I've been, of course, including Aristotle in my work on religious mathematics, although this week I've been working specifically on Plato and Pythagoras. So now I want to come to the wife of Orpheus, because men and women have to work together on this salvation project. Just today there was a lecture by a Dutch scholar who spoke about a new gospel that's come out about Mary Magdalene, which I've reviewed in my Mary Magdalene Studies Association journal just a couple of weeks ago. She was a student of Giles Quispel, who is one of my heroes. Giles Quispel was a great expert in Gnosticism, a Dutch scholar, friend of Carl Jung, and I've loved Giles Quispel's work ever since I first came across it in the 80s. Anine von der Meer, she was called, who was lecturing this morning, about this very interesting new gospel that confirms what many of us have been saying, that Mary Magdalene was a very important figure, indeed the apostle of the apostles. Well, that's the feminine help of the Christ work, if you want. I suspend judgment on the details of her particular studies. She's been researching this gospel that apparently resurfaced out of Cathar hands in the 1200s and has only just now been made available and translated. I'll look at the evidence, I'll review it. I haven't yet decided whether it's a kind of pious attempt to create that. It's a sort of, what if Mary Magdalene had written a gospel? Or is it actually a genuine thing? I don't think anyone can really say that scientifically until we've got the original manuscripts, and they're not being released, which makes me slightly suspicious. More than slightly suspicious. It's like a Székely's Hungarian Essene gospel of peace that he claimed was based on a Vatican manuscript. And of course, mysteriously, that manuscript never appeared. No, it's secretly creating his own idea of what an Essene gospel would be. And that has value. I mean, but it's not quite the same as a scientifically verifiable, carbon datable text that, yeah, this has got Mary Magdalene's like fingerprints on it, you know. So I'll suspend judgment. But what I will say is that the point is that, yes, you need the genders in balance to operate the redemption story, the mysteries. And that's something Pythagoras knew well. He loved women. I mean, he loved the Muses. He had a beautiful wife, Theano, and daughters. And in his sort of cosmic mathematics, everything that we are, everything that's in form, every person, every number, every formula, every mathematical thought, every idea, exists at the cusp between two forces. The two forces, and this is like the yin-yang, but of Greek thought. So the two forces are called apeiron, which means the infinite, the unlimited, and pyros, the limited, the form. Now, apeiron, he associated with the feminine. This is the goddess. She is infinite, like Nut, the Egyptian goddess of infinite space and the whole universe, covered with the body of the stars. Or it's like Shunya in the Buddhist tradition, the emptiness of space, which is what brings enlightenment. So the goddess is infinite space, and limit, form, is pyras, which is the male quality. That's the phallus, the thou shalt do this here, you know. Now, that's Moses sticking his staff in the rock and the water comes out. It's the male capacity to manifest specifically in a specific time and place and get stuff done. And we need them both. We exist as an interplay of these two forces, everything. And I think to Pythagoras these were metaphysical forces, that they're manifest in physical forces. Now you can say, oh yeah, primitive cosmology, but it's exactly the same as Chinese yin-yang. And theirs works in their medical system. I suspect we've lost a whole ancient esoteric medical healing system in the Pythagorean tradition that would have been nice to have retained. I think some people have retained it. I think it's there in the alchemical traditions of Paracelsus and so on. So anyway, the feminine equivalent to Pythagoras' consort was Theano, and for Orpheus it was Eurydice. Now, I spoke about her last week. Eurydice means broad justice. Eury is E-U-R-Y, means wide, broad. And dice is justice, or justice. So it's often translated as universal justice. Eurydice was the principle of universal justice. Now, and that's an incredibly important concept. Justice should not be, only available to the rich or the privileged or a little elite who've learned legal language or can afford to hire lawyers. That's what it's become now. We've lost sight of universal justice. No wonder poor old Eurydice is in Hades, being captured in the underworld, because we've sold out to corrupt legal systems that privilege the rich. The poor people can't afford universal justice. Justice has become very specific. You have to earn your day in court, and